ado, I'd like to call this House to order and welcome the Prime Minister.
Madam Speaker, this is a debate about the invisible citizens of this republic. People who live amongst us, people who contribute to the rich diversity and the prosperity of the United States, and for all intents and purposes, call themselves Americans. But people who in the status quo are relegated permanently to live in the shadows. Shadows of disenfranchisement, shadows of abuse, shadows of neglect. We say in this debate that it's time that we bring those 10 million people for the first time to the light. Two-part, very simple model. First, we're going to grant unconditional amnesty in the way the Reagan administration did, provided that they didn't break any laws, i.e. they didn't have any convictions. Two, to the extent that we're going to reappropriate those funds, we think border protection by and large has been shown to be ineffective. So we think the kinds of things that are going to do to alleviate situations overseas, intensify trade with Mexico, for instance, divert funds away from the drug war, we think that's what's going to deal with the immigration situation overseas. To that extent, I'm going to bring you three arguments. First of all, in principle, immigration ought to be as free as possible. Two things to say. First of all, we prioritize the rights of individuals to seek immigration and to enjoy the benefits of immigration over the right of any state to impose controls. First, because the derivation and the source of the state's rights are based on morally arbitrary grounds. That is to say that goodness isn't spread into particular geographical locations, that individuals fully endowed with human rights are born into many disparate situations. Compare that to the states where it is constructed through a series of legal conventions that were done mostly through the construct of Western nations. The source of the rights forces us to side with one side. But beyond that, we say that their interests are incommensurable and that we have reason to prefer that of individuals. That's why we recognize things like refugee status. That in the vast majority of instances we're going to contend that no trade-off exists between states' interests and granting these people amnesty. That is to say the United States, fairly wealthy in terms of its infrastructure and in terms of its natural resources, it's estimated can take up to 200 million people in the next decade without much strain. That is to say the 10 million to which we're granting these benefits won't be under strain. But even if it does, we still prefer that of the citizens. That's to say the United States has available to it certain alternatives that citizens don't. That is to say the United States can slightly worsen services in certain areas in exchange for giving people a fairer shot at life. We think in the vast majority of instances this amounts to that granting refugee status. But second of all, why in particular does the United States owe this obligation to the 10 million to which this debate pertains? We think citizenship, an arbitrary concept, grants and gains moral significance under two conditions. First is on the basis of reciprocity, where citizens contributing to the welfare of the state are granted recognition. That's precisely what these people are doing when they work for us, when they abide by our rules. But beyond that, we do it when people identify as American and see themselves intrinsically as a part of society. We see that, and the greatest symptom for that is that these people stuck by our laws and continue to call America home. In principle, this is just. Second, this benefits immigrants' lives. 5 reasons why this is the case. First, it takes away the constant fear of persecution, the very thing that we grant refugee status in exchange for. That is to say, not only individuals who can't go to Walmart, who can't go to their local schools without fear of their fake identity being discovered. Those people's fears go away, but so does the fear of communities who house them. That is to say that local churches who look after those people and families who take in other immigrants, usually of the same ethnic background. 2, they get better wages under our side. That is to say, for the first time, you can join the formal economy. You're no longer exploited by people who threaten to rat you out if you dare ask for higher wages. You don't get that under our side. Third, you get legal rights and access to courts in a way that doesn't exist at the moment. That's to say, when somebody runs you off on in a car on the road, right, something as mundane as that, you have very few means of recourse. You often escape, you hide from hospitals in order to prevent yourself being caught. We think that's disgusting. Fourth, you get access to benefits that other people in similar circumstances would, that if you are unemployed or going through hard times, you, as a citizen who has been abiding by its laws and contributing to its economic prosperity, get those benefits. Finally, you don't get the stigmatization of all immigrants under our side. That is to say, even people who are granted amnesty at some point or citizenship at some point. That people can't say that you, because you are Mexican, may be an illegal immigrant and treat you accordingly. We think that decreases the persecution of all ethnic minorities, including the immigrants themselves. Third argument. Hold the applause to the end. Third argument. On the United States, what does this do? Two things to talk about. First of all, it benefits the US economy. Currently, millions upon millions of dollars are spent on things that have been shown time and time again to be ineffective. That is to say, prosecuting these people, chasing them up, and deporting them. Yeah.
When you encourage more illegal immigration in the future by establishing this precedent, won't that lead to more stigmatization in the future?
So that was the part in the model where I said it hasn't been shown that incentives are what is at play. Pull factors are far less significant than the push factors. That's evident in the fact that they don't come here for a terrible life where they face the fear of persecution. They come here because the conditions of the drug war are awful. That's what we would rectify instead. So, it reduces the cost of prosecution and deportation, which has been harmful. It allows them to join the formal economy. That means the government can plan in a way that it doesn't currently about where to divert its influence, its resources, knowing where most of the people are going to work. It means finally they're able to get credit from banks and do things like start their own businesses, involving local communities and being integrated fully. That economic autonomy benefits the state as a whole. But second of all, it helps the society and the way that the societal cohesion works. First of all, this massively decreases crime. That is to say, even the illegal immigrants who are forced into criminal life cycles are done so because they have no means of recourse in legal courts, because they have lower wages than everybody else, and because they can't join the formal economy. Recognition and rights solves that problem. Finally, it reduces distrusts of immigration in particular. I've discussed that and why that's beneficial for cohesion. We're not talking about illegal immigrants, we're talking about invisible citizens who now need to be recognized. Proud to propose.
Prime Minister, and welcome the Leader of Opposition.
Madam Speaker, what we're going to tell you from opening opposition is that even as arbitrary as Bo thinks the nation-state system is, it still exists, not going away. I think that insofar as it exists in the current incarnation, those states have an obligation first and foremost to their citizens before citizens of other states, and that if an individual breaks the laws of the state that they are going to, they should face some sort of condition for breaking that law. That states have an obligation to procedural justice, to the well-being of their citizens before citizens of other countries, and this is what we're going to stand for. So, first, a little bit of clarification, then I'm going to talk a little bit about what amnesty means, why this undermines the nature of amnesty, and the nature of procedural justice, and then the state's primary responsibility to citizens' procedural justice there too. Before I do that, some framing and explicit rebuttal. So first we want to establish that we're fine with giving people who fit the standards of refugee status or fit the standards of requiring asylum that condition, right? We're not going to send people back to horrific living conditions because we don't think that's acceptable. We also think that we're fine with creating some sort of pathway to citizenship that has more requirements than simply not committing a violent crime and existing in the United States. We think there's a lot more that is required to fit these standards than simply making it here and then not breaking the law or not getting caught breaking the law. So, first explicit rebuttal. So he says immigration ought to be free, states are morally arbitrary and blah blah blah. I think I established also insofar as states gain their legitimacy from their citizens, the well-being and interests of those citizens should be taken into account. So something like changing conditions, or when even Bo concedes that this is going to worsen conditions to some extent, that the United States may even have to divert resources from its current citizens in order to take care of the illegal immigrants that it is now granting asylum. We tell you that if worsening those conditions demands consent from those governed from these people in the state, or demands some sort of justification. Given that they give you no legitimate justification, we don't think this is a legitimate policy. Not right now. Next, he says the criteria for citizenship is reciprocity and identification with the state, neither of which are conditions for the citizenship that are being granted these individuals on their side of the house. These individuals merely have to not commit a crime, not have demonstrated any sort of reciprocity, not have demonstrated any sort of identification whatsoever. I don't want to get misconstrued as saying these individuals don't necessarily fit this criteria. When you grant everyone in a blanket group the amnesty without having any sort of check to see who does and who doesn't, you necessarily include people who do not fit that criteria and violate the very principle that they stand for. And so yeah, finally, we're not going to argue that this isn't going to create short-term benefits for immigrants. I think both sides are going to agree with that. It's not really the debate here. The debate is how this is going to affect current citizens of the United States, the well-being of the United States, and how it treats its justice system. So sure, immigrants will be better off in their world in the fact that they'll have access to things that they currently don't have access to. But that's not the crux of the debate. That's not what we're going to contest. And also, pull factors are incredibly important. This is why they choose to go to areas like the United States and don't go from Nicaragua to Mexico, but keep going north, because where you end up is just as important as where you left. So they can't pretend that pull factors are less important than push factors. Constructive, go ahead.
If not based on reciprocity and identification, on what basis is an American citizen's life worth caring more than a Mexican?
I'm perfectly fine even accepting that reciprocity and identification are criteria for citizenship for American citizens. You don't make that a criteria for citizenship for the immigrants. You merely make the criteria existing in the United States and not having committed a crime. They never have to demonstrate reciprocity. They never have to demonstrate identification. We think that necessarily includes some people who will not fit the criteria, and that is something that you have to deal with. First point of constructive. What does amnesty mean? How do they undermine it? We say that amnesty exists because you acknowledge that a crime has been committed, first of all. You only amnesty someone once a law has been violated, and so they can't deny that. So you grant amnesty when either there's an unlawful conviction, but punishment has been too harsh for the crime, or for reconciliation purposes, you need the other person to exist, for example, TRC committees and things like that. We tell you that every undocumented immigrant will never fit these criteria, right? They cannot guarantee that everyone that they are granting amnesty to is going to fit into this policy without some sort of check that they do not have. So for example, someone may have violent predilections and simply not committed a crime yet. Similarly, people may have other characteristics that do not qualify as a violent crime, but still are necessarily harmful to the interests of the United States and to the citizens of the United States. For example, linkages to extremist groups or movements. Someone who hasn't actually taken extremist action yet, but may very well do so in the future. This is why we have background checks on people who are immigrating to the United States. Someone who has explicitly rejected the tenets of the United States, who has explicitly rejected the tenets of freedom and democracy and feels that they're not for them. Someone who is engaged in another non-violent crime, i.e. drug trafficking. We think these are things they all have to take into consideration, and they do not do so when they allow everyone amnesty. So take this as a few practical impacts, main one being that it undermines the very value of amnesty for those who deserve it, first of all. Which is that amnesty as a condition shifts from a desert-based condition to an opportunity-based condition. And it's fundamentally unjust to those who were deserved and denied amnesty because they didn't qualify for the desert-based condition, but it also undermines the symbolic value of amnesty. Because we tell you that amnesty is set not only for the practical benefits that it gains, but for the symbolic nature of it. It says that somehow you were necessarily wrong. Somehow something happened to you that the state must take responsibility for. And you grant an individual amnesty not because the state has failed, because they chose to break the state laws and are simply being granted amnesty by virtue of sticking around long enough, as crude as that sounds. We do not think that necessarily undermines what amnesty means, not right now. But also we think it legitimizes arguments against amnesty in the future for those who truly deserve it, because it changes it to this opportunity-based instead of desert-based condition. We tell you that conservative backlash is unquestionably going to happen in this case, and it makes it much easier for these individuals to argue against future amnesty for people who would necessarily deserve it. Finally, the state's primary responsibility to its citizens. Unquestionably, this is going to strain resources of the United States. I don't think there's any debate there, right? Like, often people who are these undocumented immigrants are going to qualify for some sort of state assistance, whether it be welfare, whether it be like healthcare costs. That's the reason they're leaving the United States. They often don't have the sort of prospects that they would in their country. They don't have the ability to be like, to have this, to not need like assistance from the system. So to say that benevolence is acceptable within limits, but a blanket policy that creates harm to citizens undermines faith in government and amounts to an abrogation of the state's responsibility to the rule of law. Because the rule of law necessarily requires adherence and support, even in the face of challenges. True procedural justice means that it's much more difficult for the state to point to structures of the justice system if it's constantly undermining those structures in the same breath. We also see that externally, the lack of adherence to regulatory standards that the United States have inspires an ignoring of those standards by others who would come to this country, and by, like the United States, attempting to engage in bilateral border negotiations. It's much difficult to say, we should stop the border, you should stop people from flowing to our state, we're going to grant individuals amnesty who violate the law. Madam Speaker, we think those amendments are valuable, we think they deserve citizenship, and it's strongly unconditional, and she don't deserve citizenship.
This House would like to thank the Leader of Opposition and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Sorry, just give me a sec. Got a lot to say. Okay, great. Panel. This nation, and indeed it is a great nation, at its core is founded upon ideals. What are those ideals? That individuals, irrespective of arbitrary characteristics, all deserve a chance at making a good life for themselves and their families. We think this model is entirely consistent with the freedom that underlies the ideal of what it is to be an American. A lot of things in this speech. I'm going to chat to you about the principle. I'm going to clash with opening opposition's contestation of amnesty. I'm going to talk to you about what it does. Their second argument was backlash. I'm going to talk to you about what it does to like notions of individuals, like building on Bo's material about social cohesion. I'm going to talk to you about the immigrants' lives there, because we don't think it's enough for them to concede the debate, right, by saying they accept that it becomes better for 10 million individuals, humans who we think are morally equivalent to you and me, and like to the extent that they have any like moral justification, I'm going to deal with that. Finally, I'm going to talk about the US and the world. I'm going to give you some rebuttal to their non-argument about how this strains US resources. Okay, the principle. What did Bo tell you? Bo told you that about 3% of the people that litter your streets are undocumented, that their mere existence is considered a crime by your government. We tell you that this is problematic, mostly because states and where people are born is morally arbitrary. These guys concede that. They say what's important is the standard of a citizen, right? What did Bo tell you? Bo told you that citizenship was based on two things, reciprocity and identity. Now this race to the middle was like I couldn't imagine it. What they said was, they're okay with our standard, we just need to demonstrate that everybody, all 10 million of the people we're going to grant amnesty to, meet that standard. We're first going to say, like, this runs to the middle because just by like general estimations, like the vast majority of these individuals do work, because that's how they make a living for themselves. Those who don't are attempting to do so for their families. And then, like, so if you just say 90% of the people we're talking about in this debate are going to concede, we're going to ask them, like, what is the conversation we're having? The third thing we're going to say to your model is how much money is it going to cost you? Like, how is it you're going to distinguish each and every single individual who comes to you? You're going to ask them for their employment history, tax records. They don't have those things, panel. And to the extent that these people have accepted that this is the standard they were willing to concede in this debate, people will fall down, like people who they think we should grant amnesty to will not meet the standard. So clearly then, that was not a starter in this debate. They need to give you a more clear articulation of what is going on in their conception. What do they say? They say, they give you like an enumerated number of standards by which we grant amnesty. That's entirely question begging for the purposes of this debate in the absence of a justification of those standards, and we didn't hear one in the previous speech. But to the second thing we say with regards to response to that argument is, You said the first standard you'd set is an unjust law. We tell you that not recognizing these individuals if they contribute to our society meets that precise requirement. Okay, what's the second argument they gave you? The second argument they gave you is that we're less likely to be empathetic with individuals who don't have rights in the future. And this is the new material in Deputy which I'm adding. This radically changes the political climate in the United States. If I add 10 million Americans, people who are ready and very willing to vote, given they know what it's like not to be enfranchised in this country and they don't want to relive that experience, you radically change the nature of your politics. Why is this? The margins are incredibly small when it comes to electoral politics in the United States. You don't need me, a Swazi, to remind you of that fact. What changes then? What changes then under our side? With 10 million Americans, the vast majority of which are very willing to vote, we think you reduce racism writ large. How? One, first the media, right? The Fox News can't continue blabbering on about like those undocumented immigrants who are trying to take our jobs. Those people are recognized as Americans. Moreover, the incentives of those individuals who run those corporations recognize that they now need to appeal to a wider audience because those people have been enfranchised. Finally, the GOP, my favorite chat in debates. These people can no longer run along fundamentally racist politics, which we think are unacceptable in this debate. The vast majority of like the educated world agrees with us with this regard. Okay, let's talk then about their lives, the lives of immigrants, the things that these guys said they're willing to concede, improve in this debate. Imagine, panel, if your life was considered a crime. The mere fact that you walk around in the United States was something that you could be arrested for, you could be deported, you'd be harassed, and very many people could take advantage of you. This could be anything as far as your employers or just other individuals perpetrating crimes against you. You can't go, for instance, if you're a victim of domestic abuse, to the police because you fear the repercussions of that action. To the extent that we're all concerned with moral questions in this debate, these are crimes you perpetrate on your side of the house. And you just can't just be like, okay, yeah, it's fine, you improve the life of 11 million people and we're just going to continue to have this debate. There is nothing to be spoken about if that's the case. I'm going to add an additional layer then to how we improve their lives in this argument. What is this? To the extent then that these guys say that we both gave you 5 reasons, they're very good. I think closing opposition heard them. They'll probably have something to say to them. I don't know how you're going to adjudicate like the knife question when we talk about it. Anyway, just to add a little bit of material then with regards to wages. To the extent that people are born in this country and recognized as citizens, what do we change on our side of the house? You enable their parents to give them to like live a reasonable life, right? Because these guys conceded we improve wages of immigrants. What does that mean? That means regular Americans that meet their standard of being Americans get better lives. That means their education is more likely to be better because you can go home and get like your parents to read to you at night and that sort of thing. All the benefits of privilege that accrue. I'm going to take closing opposition if they have anything to say in a bit. Yale doesn't want to talk to Harvard. Okay.
The problem is the question isn't who improves their lives, but how we decide whose lives are improved and the process by which we
both gave you a standard. One you chose not to engage with. You just accepted it, but we told you the vast majority of the people we're talking about in today's debate meet precisely that standard. We're going to like, yeah, the deputy's going to need to disagree with the leader of the opposition in this case. Okay, quickly, wages. Americans, who they accept are Americans, people born in this country, their lives improve under our model because their parents are able to give them a better standard of living. Something they can't accept, like they can't just ignore in this debate. The US and the world both told you we improve the economy and reduce crime. They said it puts a strain on our resources. 3 responses here. Now the fact is, you can take 200 million people between now and like a year from now without any strain to your economy. This is just a fact, but I'll tell you what the reasons are. Firstly, it's a lot of land in America, right? Alaska is a very good example of this. Secondly, you have very good infrastructure, right? Don't listen to the GOP as they like ramble on about America taking like Barack Obama ruining America. The third thing to say is the marginal utility of labor in this country with a high level of capital is incredibly high. As a consequence, your economy improves by increasing the labor force. We reduce crime because these people cooperate with the police and stop all the drug crimes that these guys are concerned with in opening opposition. Panel, there's a right here and everybody's lives improve. Incredibly.
This House would like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister and welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good.
Madam Speaker, that was very nice. We heard that, yes, improving lives of immigrants will have several spin-off effects. We agree. Our job is not to defend whether or not we should take the nasty approach to immigrants it takes right now, but specifically whether this law should support a meaningful distinction on the non-commission of crime as a mechanism for reducing citizenship. That is particularly what today's debate is about. So I'd beg a few questions, 5 big ones, like evaluate today's debate. Can undesirability to enter one's country or to be a citizen exist in a zone between pure innocence and criminal guilt? We'd say it can. We say that, largely speaking, there are political features of citizenship that make it meaningful, that are not only your innocence, for example. Like, citizenship, sadly, is both an inclusionary and exclusionary narrative. That is, it is who you are, but it also is not who you are not. And therefore, because you are that person, you give up these rights in this thing called a social contract to the state, and it generally has those political features to it. That's what makes it meaningful. That's why you have processes towards it. I'd say, for example, like, one aspect of American citizenship could be, do you support democracy? We think that would be an adequate feature of it. Not simply you not commit a crime. For example, why do we even have visa interviews? I should be able to simply sail on a boat to Florida and go to school at Morehouse. I'm not particularly from here. But what's important is that in admitting persons to your country, we accept that there's also an element of your desirability. It is not simply between criminal innocence and criminal guilt. We say at that point, when you reduce the criteria for the political engagement between one and the state, that is not one, what the state was ever founded upon, no. 2, it undermines the very contractual nature of that state. In that, in particular state, persons contract into certain political, economic, social arrangements that are different per state. We'd say, in America, one of those complex political arrangements exists here, and to reduce the nature of all of that history of American democracy and nation building to simply, did you or did you not commit a crime, A, or were you particularly caught convicting that crime, B, we think that's particularly dangerous for the nature of political arrangement. So again, we're not defending like everything bad to do with immigrants. Like, as one, I'd perfectly be fine liberalizing how we provide private citizenship. What I wouldn't be okay to do, for example, is to say, simply because I'm innocent today, I am desirable for all of you great people here today. I don't think that's fair. So, like, yeah. So, however, we wouldn't conduct, for example, under the extension of that logic, we shouldn't conduct visa interviews, point of entry assessments, background checks, because per Bo's logic, quote, we should prioritize the rights of anybody as an immigrant over the state's ability to control because where we're born is arbitrary. That may all be factually true that where we're born is arbitrary, but it is still meaningful in a political engagement. So yes, many arbitrary factors exist that we now ascribe, because we're social beings, political meaning. For example, it's arbitrary that I'm brown, but it's pretty meaningful, isn't it? Like the practical stuff, because that sounded really, really nice. But the practical stuff, I want to talk about political backlash. I think it's more important than making it sound. What climate do we exist in today? We exist in a political climate in which we couldn't pass, for example, very liberal immigration law like the DREAM Act. We live in a political climate in which Republicans have sued the President of the United States because of the action we took over immigration. What I'm saying is this. We're in a particular political juncture in which immigration as a hot topic has a significant political gridlock and brickmanship. Insofar as Washington, D.C. can't get a budget because Republicans won't allow us to even talk about it before we reverse immigration, we live in a particular climate in which political backlash is not just something that we assert in debate, but is very real and has held up American government over this particular issue. We say taking even liberal immigration action, which we already support, has already caused backlash. What will a carte blanche, unconditional amnesty on not committing a crime do for the very same persons that immigrants have to live with? More importantly, for the very same persons who hold the economic, social, and political capital to oppress said persons and entrench particular views about said persons. Because the government has said being American is simply not committing a crime. We think that's particularly pernicious. No. So, who is stigmatizing immigrants? Because the persons supporting immigration reform are not the ones stigmatizing immigrants. The persons whose minds you want to change are not the ones who hold these particular views, who will necessarily be entrenched because their arguments about your Americanness will entirely go out the window when we say the nature of Americanness is only innocent, not yet soon. Finally, I want to talk about the future. Very importantly, we hear that there are no limits on this. It's going to be now and forever for the most part. We don't hear about that. What does the future look for this flow of persons coming here? Back.
You claim that the state only has a moral obligation to improve the lives of its own citizens, but the functionaries of the state are people with moral obligations. Why do their obligations change when they enter their job?
Okay, two responses. One, never said that. I said that we have a moral, as Emmanuel says, a moral obligation to everybody. So we define providing like asylum to persons who fit like conventional asylum categories. We think that's fine, and expanding those, providing refugee status, but also we say the primary political arrangement and primary political obligation is to the persons in that nation state, and is secondly to the political features of that state's citizenship, and therefore we say a nature that undermines that moral obligation, i.e. reduce it to innocent, is problematic. That's what we said. Really quick on the future. This diverse responsibility to resolve push factors in states of origin. People emigrate for all these push factors that we agree with, we know what they are. The problem with this, and a perpetual ability to just come, be innocent for an undetermined point of time and get that, is that the push issues in Central America never get resolved. What do I mean about this? You shift the paradigm of US immigration, necessarily creating problems in the home states. A, there are now limited incentives or none to like address issues back home. There's limited social investment from both the immigrants and the citizens who have got left because they're no longer uncertain as to the percent. They leave, they'll be there forever. They just have economies based on remittances, and the issues that have been caused by like American trade policy and America's own and foreign policy never get resolved because there are literally no incentives to stay because you have a perpetual open license to go to the States. We think that's really, really bad for the features in the particular state. And for those reasons, we wouldn't support a paradigm shift of America is no longer the land of the free, the brave, and the democratic. It's a land of the you're innocent today, you have a passport. For those reasons, we're proud to oppose.
This House would like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition and welcomes the Member of Government.
Panel, there are three claims that opposition can advance to prove their case. They can attempt to prove that this harms American citizens. I think that opening government has done an adequate job addressing that. Secondly, they can argue that the state should indeed privilege its own citizens over all other individuals. And thirdly, they can claim that the conditions of amnesty are not met. What we're going to bring you in extension is quite simply this. Even if it harmed American citizens, and even if it did so quite a bit, we don't care. We are going to say that the state's obligations lie not to its own citizens, but in fact, in the exact same manner that individuals possess moral obligations. We're going to defeat the claim that opening opposition gave you, that there was a primary obligation to your own citizens, and we're going to show it for the farce that it is. And then after we do that, in our second point of extension, we're going to explain that these individuals are not guilty of a crime at all, that what they have done indeed should be given amnesty, because there is no crime to properly prosecute them under, that what they have violated is itself not a law at all. Before that, one point of extraneous refutation. We hear from the Deputy Leader of Opposition that that which is arbitrary can still be meaningful. Indeed, it can be, and it is with respect to identity. But they must prove something further. They must prove that those individuals who don't ascribe value to that identity, those individuals for whom where they are born is not the place that they want to remain, should be burdened with that identity. That even though by choice they choose to value something else, we must burden them with exclusion. And indeed, we say that you cannot force someone to ascribe value to something that they do not value. So, firstly, why the state has an obligation to do what is right, not what is right for its citizens. So, vagueness about the social contract aside, which I've never seen or sighed, or some distinction between the notion that we can give refugee status in the good cases, but there's some odd primary obligation that is different from the general obligation. What we're going to attack is the central notion that the state should somehow differentiate between its own citizens and those that are elsewhere in the world, except where it may have to by logical reasons. So, the state is, at bottom, a useful fiction. It is the military, legal, bureaucratic, and other ways in which people fulfill reciprocal relations to each other by necessity. Each person in that structure, obviously, has an obligation to fulfill what is moral. The claim that side opposition must prove is that when I wake up in the morning in a few months, before I go into my job in the federal government, I have an obligation to do what is moral. But the moment that I enter the threshold of that building, the moment I enter my job at the federal government, my obligations suddenly change. I suddenly have to become a functionary of something that would be morally impermissible in any reasonable expectation. That before, when I would be a monster if I turned away the poor and hungry, I am obligated to turn away the poor and hungry. Where before I would be a monster if I denied meaningful employment and a meaningful chance at a career to large swaths of people, now I am obligated to do so. We tell you no such change occurs. At no point do my moral obligations change. There is a veil side opposition constructs. It is the veil that the state is something separate from the persons that constitute that state. There is no distinction. What we fundamentally tell you is that their claims must ultimately ground in the notion that because something is worse off for those that are currently citizens, arbitrary or non-arbitrary, any distinction you like to draw, the state has different obligations. But if those differential obligations don't exist, we say that any reasonable calculation about the benefits to those other people exceeding the harms to our own must obviously obligate the state in a clear way. I'll take closing.
Opening tells us that citizenship is meaningful and based on reciprocity. You say it is complete fiction. Which of these is true, and which of these does government bench advocate?
There is a distinction between residency and citizenship, right? What we are saying is that we are denying these people residency. Citizenship might have a different discussion. We'll talk about that later. So, what we tell you is, secondly, in our second point of extension, that these people have committed no crime. What we tell you is, it is not enough for a law to merely be passed by the House and Senate and duly signed for a president to make it a law. Laws were passed establishing segregation, laws were passed as prohibiting women's suffrage, and laws were passed allowing for the internment of the Japanese, but none of these, properly speaking, should have had the force of law. That they are signed or that they exist as legislation does not make them just, and we say that the individual has no obligation to follow the law merely because it is law. We tell you, from the individual colonists who originally resisted British colonial laws that were unjust, to Martin Luther King and the civil rights marches, there has obviously been grounds to resist laws, to disobey them, and to violate them. We say that the laws that these citizens are guilty of violating were not laws at all, and they were correct to not follow them. We tell you that laws denying entry to the United States are laws that are fundamentally unjust. Right. So the only thing we tell you that could possibly justify these laws, could possibly justify this exclusion, given how dramatic the nature of the moral harm of doing so is if these individuals directly infringe on the liberty of the other, which answers this chat that we have in opening opposition about how these individuals are being excluded if they committed an offense, but not for other possible reasons. Well, of course those that have committed a criminal violation ought to be excluded. They have denied the liberty of an other, but that case is not met here. Opening.
Yeah, so just to be clear, since like laws preventing access to the states are unjust, you A, advocate unmitigated access of anybody to come in whatsoever, and secondly, if I commit a criminal offense, is it okay if I violate the law because I didn't believe in them? Like, since laws are meaningful, so the criminal offense is meaningful too?
Criminal offenses are meaningful laws because they are just. And as for open borders, we think that given the enormous success of free flows of capital and technology, the world would be a much better place indeed where there's similar free flows of labor. We agree with opening government on that. So, states cannot nullify the moral value of human beings. States cannot, by their creation, change the fact that each and every person is a person with human worth and a person with human dignity. And if that is the case, the laws that abridge those the fundamental nature of these persons are not laws at all. They are guilty of nothing. As we would exercise prosecutorial discretion over those who violated the segregation laws or resisted Jim Crow, we so too should exercise amnesty here. They are not guilty of anything worth punishing.
This House would like to thank the member of government and welcomes the member of opposition.
Oh, jeez. I get nervous speaking in front of large crowds, probably why I should do debate. All right, let's go. So, I just want to start out by kind of reframing a lot of the context for the cases under which it's taking place. I think we've heard a lot of discussion about people coming from Mexico, but I think what they fail to address all throughout the round is that there are significant amounts of illegal immigrants currently in the United States as a result of having overstayed visas, as a result of actively deceiving the government with regard to those policies. So I think those are cases where the individual doesn't have the mitigating factor of these circumstances from which they came to address it. So those are cases that need to be dealt with. So before I go into my three main points, I want to rebut the idea that we have heard from the government extension, with the obligation to help all individuals regardless of where they come from. We think that this is an active right for what opening government told you, insofar as they told you that reciprocity is the standard upon which we give these individuals a place within our society, and that there's a meaningless distinction between the residency that they're talking about and the track of citizenship that they're being put on. But also I think that, furthermore, the logical extension of this argument is absolutely absurd. If you believe this argument, we have the obligation to completely scrap these social services for people within the United States who already have relatively higher standards of living, and donate the entirety of the current budget of the United States to nations that currently have greater issues with their citizens. Obviously, this isn't the case. We don't think that this should be standard for the round. So, three arguments for the round. Firstly, we think that, no thank you, that we shouldn't encourage future illegal immigration. So we think that the people who are being displaced by the current drug war in Mexico might come on either side of the house, but what they're ignoring on government bench is the people who currently are not coming, but would have come in the future, and those people extended across time. We think that there are significant financial risks incurred by taking up your home and moving it to the United States, that they have other alternatives necessarily within Mexico, like moving to the city where it isn't strife with violence. And we think that those are things that people might do in the status quo, but are going to be encouraged to do, or encouraged to come to the United States under these circumstances. So, no thank you. So two things along this. Firstly, when you pass this kind of law, it sets the expectation that this will be a precedent that will be upheld in the future, insofar as the economic and social circumstances outlined by team government are going to be the same under any particular case. That means in the future, people will come with the expectation that they'll receive amnesty as long as they don't commit violent crimes. But also, people will come under the current law, because by very nature of illegal immigration, there is no entrance date that is officially on the records for these places. That means individuals might try to get in the country in the very close to the present circumstances, because they want to be covered under the umbrella of this law, which encourages more illegal immigration. We think that this is a huge problem because now you're actively denying people the rights who otherwise deserve them. It is true that certain factors are arbitrary, but the arbitrary factors that they are punishing for on their side of the house is the arbitrariness of birth, where people want to come to the United States from overseas but can't do so by simply crossing the border. Those people are actively denied spots under those circumstances, but also the arbitrariness of birth for people who actively respected the processes by which you obtain citizenship within the nation, who didn't violate the rule of law. We think that you're taking away spots from those individuals. The second class of arguments I want to talk about are the conditions that we would actually attach. No thank you. We get from opening opposition that there are things that we should attach citizenship to, but we're going to actually give you the mechanisms by which we think that this should happen. No thank you. We think that there are a host of good options, so things like requiring education, things like requiring volunteer work or community service are things that they're not getting on their side of the house, but also things like making sure that your employers actually have a job lined up and willing to hire you after you've been granted citizenship. We think that because of the nature of your legal status within the nation, that creates a coercive pressure that makes it such that you're willing to accept lower wages, which might make employers more willing to hire you with a status quo. But when this kind of policy is passed, the higher price relative means that there's going to be large structural unemployment within these places. We think that you should at least guarantee that you have a job after the fact before you do that. No thanks. We also think that another great conditionalization policy that you could do is conditionalize it on illegal immigrants turning in their employers who use the dire of circumstances they were in to coerce them into these jobs in the first place. No thanks. So things like where employers are bullying their employees by virtue of their legal status to accept lower wages, to accept improper working conditions, we can conditionalize granting them citizenship based on this factor, that if they're willing to turn in their employer, no thank you, that they can grant citizenship. We think these kinds of policies are great because the employer certainly wasn't forced out by the drug war. The employer was unjustly taking advantage of circumstances and actually encouraging future illegal immigration. As such, the employer is responsible, and this kind of conditionalization is something that actually gets some kind of retribution for those employers. Okay.
Are you more or less likely to get higher refugee intake or pro-immigration policies that you're describing when you do or don't enfranchise 11 million people who know what it's like to live in that condition?
So we think that the enfranchisement that they're talking about on opening government is not likely to happen in the places where these immigrants are actually going to be coming in. Places like Arizona, places like Texas, where they are so predominantly GOP, as described by the opening government, that they're just not going to get the kind of changes that they want to see on their side of the house for a variety of reasons. So firstly, it is just the case that the influx of these immigrants, like it might be true that we can handle 10 million immigrants nationally, but they will be focused among the border states in these places, and this is a huge problem for them on their side of the house for two main reasons. No thanks. Firstly, if we're talking about one-third provision of social services, there's a huge problem there because these states just aren't equipped to deal with the influx of these millions of immigrants, not only who are currently there and now will be on the programs, but all of the people that they're encouraging to come in the future. The reasons why immigrants want to come in the future is the provision of these services. No thanks. Then the influx is going to lead to shortages of funding. That means current citizens to whom you have a greater obligation are going to be shut out. That means immigrants who applied they're legally are going to be shut out. But also the impact of this deals necessarily with the political arguments that they're making, right? Because at the point where you are a voter in these places, at the point where you are someone who feels like your services have been cut because other people violated the law and the government let them in scot-free, we think that it is going to lead to the rise of these nativist sentiments, these sentiments that harm actively the standard of life. No thanks. And we think that the way this argument functions is that you have to believe on their side of the house to vote for them, that the lives of immigrants are going to be better, but at the point where, politically speaking, they're going to be in a significantly worse place, that is even worse on their side of the house. No thanks. The final thing that I want to talk about is how this leads to greater policing and violence between the police and immigrants. There is one way for the people in these places to make sure that those immigrants don't gain citizenship. These people already have a very adversarial relationship between these illegal immigrants and the law enforcement in these areas. So if the only way for them to get out to deny these people citizenship is for them to be convicted of a violent crime, this means we are going to see an overall increase in policing. We think that this is going to be a huge problem and tension within these relationships because already people in these communities don't want to see more immigrants coming in, and there's extreme sentiment against these. So what we see then, there's going to be democratic measures where the police are given greater funding, greater powers to ultimately fight immigrants by using it the one way they know how, which is to get them convicted of a violent offense, which makes it such that they're never going to go out of the country. And this kind of practice and measure isn't just limited to the present circumstance, but also to the future as well. At the point where these individuals the people in the communities believe that these laws might be implemented in the future, that means now there's an incentive to racially profile. Now there's an incentive to over-police and make sure that you can get as many immigrants with violent convictions on the books such that they're not going to be taking social services in the future. For these reasons, we're so proud to oppose.
This House would like to thank the member of opposition and welcome the government whip to close out the case for the government bench.
The central question of this round has become, who deserves to be an American citizen? Unfortunately, side opposition never truly engages with this question. The most we truly get out of them is a response of, well, I mean, I don't really know who deserves to be a citizen, but you know what? Just being innocent definitely isn't enough. That they are totally sure of on side opposition. We tell you that simply isn't enough of a standard in the round. We have given you a consistent standard, and therefore you must vote side government. But also we tell you, and this is really important, about how these moral obligations are always going to outweigh, right? And that's the first thing I'm going to talk about. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the amnesty question. But first, let's talk about moral obligation for a second. The other question they have yet to answer is, why is it that I deserve to live in America, that we all deserve to live in America, but that an undocumented immigrant from perhaps, I don't know, South America, doesn't deserve to live in America? What is it that I do or you do that implicitly means we are better individuals who deserve to have more access to economic activity, who deserve to have more political rights? Well, the only thing is that we were born here, right? Like perhaps after the fact of becoming citizens, we could do things like pay taxes or vote, but we aren't even giving these immigrants an opportunity to do so. We tell you that if you give them the opportunity to become citizens, they will do so, they will pay you back twofold, they will work within the American framework of what we expect from citizenship and what we want Americans to be. No, thank you. So what do we tell you about morality? We tell you that governments are fundamentally made of people. We tell you that moral obligations exist from person to person. I have a moral obligation not to hurt you, but to help you. Insofar as that is true, we tell you, the government does not have a moral obligation only to its own citizens, but rather citizens have moral obligations to other people, regardless of where they are born or where they came from. This is an extremely important argument, right? We tell you, therefore, that if you are starving, I must, because of my moral obligations, give you some food. If you are drowning, I can take on a marginal harm of getting wet to save you from dying. We tell you that in this same way, this is always going to outweigh. Saving the lives of 10 million people is always going to outweigh, because each individual has a moral obligation to every other individual. The only thing we truly hear out of this from side opposition is the idea that, well, you're not really saving them, because these immigrants are ultimately going to be worse off. We think this is ridiculous for a lot of reasons. We tell you that when they become citizens, not only are they going to be documented, but they're going to have access to important laws that are going to protect them. We tell you they no longer have to live in fear of constantly being deported. We tell you they will have more stable lives insofar as they are able to hold consistent jobs, and again, never be afraid that they're going to be deported. But then they tell us that in terms of moral obligations, it just doesn't matter, right? Because you're going to be hurting your own people in the following ways. Like perhaps all these new immigrants are going to take your wages. We think this is also ridiculous for 3 reasons. First of all, we say that we would be able to bite that harm. We say that I can take on a small marginal harm so that your life can be better. I say that if you're starving and I have to give up 1 slice of my entire cake, that's probably okay that I get 1 less slice of cake and you don't starve to death. We tell you the marginal harms to American citizens are not going to be outweighed by the enormous benefits to these immigrants, and that's why we're winning this round. But even if you don't buy any of these moral obligations, we tell you there are other reasons. We tell you that employment in the U.S. is not a zero-sum game. We tell you that when economic activity increases, more businesses will spring up, employment will also increase. But more importantly, we tell you that a lot of the issues with low wages is because these immigrants are undocumented, they don't have any political power. But when they are recognized as documented immigrants and they do have this political power, suddenly you have a lot of incentives to improve labor conditions, to raise the minimum wage, to have all these changes, because otherwise they're completely being ignored. All right, I'll take opening.
Great. So just on your moral consistency, Alex says that laws are unjust and should be broken, but you make breaking a law the sole criterion for exclusion from amnesty. How do you deal with that moral consistency?
So here's what we tell you. We tell you that breaking certain laws that are unjust is okay. We tell you killing someone is not okay. That's why we're not admitting violent felons, because we don't want them to commit more crimes, right? I don't think this is a meaningful question. But also then they tell us on the opposition that you're going to be setting a precedent. Good. We tell you it is a good thing that these immigrants are going to be able to immigrate. But also then, let's quickly talk about this amnesty issue. The question is, when do we give amnesty? Opposition is correct when they say we give amnesty when we find that this person did not actually actually commit a crime. We tell you that trying to immigrate into the United States is absolutely not a crime. We tell you there are plenty of laws, if you look at the letter of the law, that are very restrictive, discriminatory, and should not have existed in the first place historically. We tell you about segregation, and we tell you about civil disobedience, and why it is okay to break these laws in order to prove to society that they need to move forward, right? Because ultimately, in a couple of decades, in a few years, society will move forward, they will change these laws. Insofar as this is bound to happen anyway, we tell you now is the time where you should be able to fight against these laws. That's the only thing that actually creates meaningful change, which is what we are going to get on our side of the house. We tell you that insofar as the immigrants have not broken any law, and if you think they did break a law, they were certainly justified in doing so, you have to give them amnesty. That is definitionally why we give them amnesty. So I think the weighing calculus in this round is going to be about the millions of lives that you could end up saving on the government side of the house. We tell you that even if there are some harms through this policy, even if some of the existing Americans have to take on this burden, as an individual, you have the moral obligation to take on this burden insofar as it isn't so burdensome that it will destroy your life. On the other hand, if you continue not to give amnesty to these undocumented immigrants, it could very well destroy their lives, insofar as they could be deported at any moment, insofar as any money or savings that they have ever added up could just go away because they can't live in this country anymore, insofar as they could be completely separated from their families. We say the harms that are happening on our side of the house are never going to be outweighed. You've never told us why an American is more important than someone who isn't an American. We say they all deserve the opportunity to have this chance. For all these reasons, we are so proud.
This House would like to thank the government whip and welcomes the opposition whip to close out the case for the opposition bench.
Thank you, members of the panel. We on closing opposition believe that well-intentioned but overly broad policies are not realistic solutions to a nuanced and complex problem. In this speech, I will prove why this policy both ignores the state's obligations and perpetuates the plight of many undocumented immigrants. We believe that the actual solution is much more stringent conditioning, for example, on an employer's willingness to employ you legally, and we think that is the way that we recognize the moral claims the government bench makes such a fuss about. First, I'm going to do three things in this speech. First, I'm going to explain whether or not this policy is philosophically justified. Second, I'm going to explain how this changes the incentives of potential immigrants and employers within society. And finally, I will explain how this shifts the political climate both domestically and internationally. First, is this policy philosophically justified? GovBench says that states are arbitrary and mere fictions. We say nonetheless, out of necessity, as closing government concedes, that there are limited resources and the state must prioritize. Sure, civil disobedience may sometimes be justified, but we tell you that immigration laws serve a useful purpose that is not mere arbitrary discrimination. We tell you it is legitimate differentiations above the group that government wants to broadly prioritize. First, it's demonstrated concrete claims, for example, to refugee status or asylum status. For example, my father, who spent 10 years in a Vietnamese prison camp. We think those individuals have strong moral claims as well. It is arbitrary, equally, that immigrants who live within our borders were able to cross the border or obtain a visitor visa and overstay their welcome. We think that is an arbitrary distinction on their side of the house. So the other thing that OG tells us is that these individuals are citizens because they reciprocally contribute to the state. Opening opposition sets up the idea that not all undocumented immigrants who don't commit crimes or merely were not caught or reciprocally contribute to the state. But we tell you that the best mechanism by which to do this is the conditioning on employers' willingness to employ them legally. I'm going to explain this in my second point, not at this time. Second question, how does the government's policy change the incentives of potential immigrants and employers in society? First, under this point, we tell you that a broad-based policy sends a particularly strong signal that the United States may accept them whenever they come in the future. OG tells you that it's difficult to verify individuals' status. This is because they're undocumented. This is exactly why more individuals will come in the future to exploit this ambiguity, given that there is difficult enforcement. We think that is particularly harmful on our side of the House. Why is this the case? Second point under this question, we tell you, not this time, we tell you that employers will hire illegally because they don't need to pay minimum wages, they don't need to provide certain overtime benefits or health benefits, and all the benefits that OG provides to you. We tell you that when these individuals acquire citizenship under this policy, employers will just dump them on the streets and hire the next illegal immigrant who hears about this policy and then comes to the United States. They'll continue to hire illegal immigrants and pay cents on the dollar. We think that is particularly harmful. Why is this the case? A few reasons. First, we tell you that means that these individuals are relying on the government safety net, which trades off with the ability to actually advocate for citizens' interests. But second, we think that actually fuels the GOP's rhetoric, as OG is so terrified about, because Fox News' rhetoric has actually come to fruition. We think that is particularly harmful. We tell you that when you have the additional condition that employers will actually hire you legally after you acquire the citizenship, that prevents that specific harm from occurring. We think that is particularly important on our side of the House, that you don't have a situation where these individuals are essentially dumped on the streets by employers and then who continue to exploit other individuals. Another condition, for example, of turning in your employer also stops that kind of harm. We think that this is well-intentioned but overly broad, but you disagree. Close.
You say that there are trade-offs between which immigrants we take. Why not take them all?
So the state has limited resources. We cannot take every single person that wants to come to the United States. We think that in an ideal world, for example, Brown and Harvard and Yale and Morehouse would accept every student that wants to come, but it's clearly not the case that we can do that. We tell you that ultimately you have to make difficult choices. We don't think this group should be prioritized. No. Third question. How does this policy change the political climate domestically and internationally? We tell you there are two harms that occur. First, what happens on their side of the House is that they essentially subsidize the failures of other nations to redress the socioeconomic conditions that are difficult and poor within their own borders. So if states are arbitrary, then they absolve other nations or the political leaders within those nations of the obligation to actually fix those issues and put the burden on the United States. We don't think that is the case. We think that you ultimately remove any political will for those countries to actually address their problems. You reduce the leverage of the United States to actually push for greater measures within these countries and more accurate and more capable governance. Second question under this point. We say that this undermines politics domestically. So, opening government tells you that they will lead to greater enfranchisement of these individuals and ultimately address these problems because these individuals will be able to vote and fix these inadequate policies. We tell you this is not the case because states are overwhelmingly GOP, particularly in the states where these individuals are crossing over to, and gerrymander to actually keep their stranglehold on politics. So this, whatever marginal increase in terms of enfranchisement on their side of the House is not enough to tip the scales in the state legislature and pass a reform bill, or actually tip the scales in terms of electing a different governor that will actually pass that bill. We think, therefore, the likely outcome is to only increase racial profiling and police abuses towards minorities, because the only way to deny someone citizenship on their side of the House becomes trying to prove that they have committed this criminal offense. We think that increases police brutality towards these minorities and ultimately harms the groups that they're trying to protect on their side of the House. So look, we agree that something needs to be done, but we think an overly broad policy with good intentions is not the way to do that. For that reason, we're proud to oppose.